I'm Blake Newsom, the Dean of Chapel at New Orleans Seminary, here today with Dr. Thom Rainer, the President of LifeWay. We're going to talk a little bit about the state and future of evangelical Christianity, Southern Baptist Convention, and just what advice he would have for future ministers. So, Dr. Rainer, we thank you for being with us and participating in the interview. And let's just start with a question about what excites you, what concerns you about the state of evangelical Christianity in the U.S. and around the world.
Well, I'm glad you had a question of such specificity to begin with. There are a lot of things that excite me. You go back to the 20th century and you see the blossoming growth of Christianity in Africa. You see the blossoming growth in South America, and now it's shifting to Asia, and you're seeing so many people come to Christ. You look around the world at what God's doing, what His Spirit's doing, you can't help but get excited. Many times we get anxious about the Muslim world, and I understand that fully. But when it's all said and done, we would estimate, and experts who are smarter than I am would estimate, that by the middle of this century, by 2050, we'll have about 3 billion Christians, and just worldwide, and just the Pentecostal Christians alone will outnumber the Muslims. So God is doing a great work. His Spirit seems to work in different pockets at different times. Europe had its time. North America had its time, 20th century, Africa, Latin America to some extent. Now Asia, you hear a lot about the Chinese church and what is taking place there, but of course it's not limited. So there's a lot to be excited about. Then you go on the other hand, and I would probably shift immediately to North America. Particularly the United States. Canada would be included, but particularly the United States. And I would look and see what's happening, and I would be concerned about evangelical Christianity. I'd be concerned about the state of Christianity specifically. If you look over the course of several generations, the Builder generation, those born before 1946, we estimate we reached about 65% of that generation. You move up to one more recent generation, you have my generation, the Boomers, born between 1946 and 1964, and that number went from 65 to 35, we estimate. It's probably the biggest one-generation drop-off in the history of our nation, and that is a significant concern. You go even further, and you get to Gen X, those born between 65 and 79, and that number jumps, or actually goes down to 27%. Then you get to the millennial generation, those born between 1980 and 2000, and we estimate the number's about 15%. Now that's a lot of numbers, Blake, but my point is 65% of the Builder generation, those born before 1946, now your generation, born between 1980 and 2000, only 15% are Christians. So look at the state of American Christianity, particularly the U.S., and I see that evangelical churches are doing a pretty weak job at penetrating culture, reaching people for Christ. There's much to be excited about. God's Spirit is always at work throughout the world. There's much to be concerned about, and much of that is taking place right in our backyards. Acts 1:8 is the mandate that we often refer to, and we rightly get concerned about Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria to the ends of the earth, and Samaria to the ends of the earth are what grab our attention, and I understand that because that's where God is working. But Jerusalem needs a lot of work, and Judea needs a lot of work, and particularly in the backyard of American Christians. So long question, long general answer, and basically a lot of excitement in many areas, a lot of concern in our own backyard.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the millennials. Let's talk for a minute about millennials. You co-authored a book with your son Jess on millennials. Well, let me ask you this way. Should churches be afraid of millennials? Should they be afraid of reaching millennials? And how can a church go about reaching millennials if we're reaching them in such a poor way right now?
Well, let's phrase it this way. Some churches should be very fearful of reaching millennials. Now you say that's not a very smart answer because you're supposed to have a great commission heart and you're supposed to be reaching anyone. Millennials will not accept churches as usual. They will not accept church business as usual. Millennial Christians specifically are going to scour the budget of a church and ask, why are we spending this money here and this money there, and what difference is it making? They will look at what staff does, what pastors do, and they will ask the question, are we making the most efficient use of those who have been called to vocational ministry through this church? They will look at the community and they will say, okay, what are we doing day by day reach our communities, to impact our communities. And if they do not get satisfactory answers, they're going to run. They're going to walk immediately. They will either go to another church down the street, or they will create their own church. So millennials in many churches will be a disruptive force. Now, I'm speaking of millennial Christians. We'll get back to the millennial non-Christians in just a moment. But the millennial Christians will be highly disruptive in the sense that they understand that they are a minority. They understand that they stand out from their generation. They understand that they're about 1 out of 7. And so they have made a commitment to the Savior that they take, frankly, a lot more seriously than predecessor generations as a whole. And so they have proven to be highly disruptive in many of our churches who do business as usual. Now, on the other hand, the 15% of Christians who come in and begin to be disruptive for the good and churches embrace it, they have seen their churches become some of the most evangelistic in the course of their history. And so churches could be excited about receiving millennials if they have an attitude that we will learn from these younger people. How about the 85%? The 85% that we estimate who are not believers, who will not be believers at some point in their lives. You shouldn't be afraid of them. They are not antagonistic toward the gospel. They could care less. In fact, I wish they were more antagonistic so they would engage Christians more. But that 85%, as a general rule, have a very blasé attitude about religion, and specifically Christianity. They are nothing to fear, but they are young people, young adults, ready to be engaged if they see something different about your life and that you are making a difference where you are. You know what we're getting back to? We're getting back to first century realities. And we're looking at the Jerusalem church in America now, and I understand I'm mixing my metaphors, but now that church is surrounded by non-believers, but a few core Christians are ready to change the world. So I'm excited about millennials overall. I hope I'm excited. I got 3 sons who are millennials.
Well, in talking about the Southern Baptist Convention specifically, I know you've pastored, you've been serving in the Southern Baptist Convention for a number of years. Where do you see the state of the Southern Baptist Convention right now and its trajectory over the next 5 or 10 years?
It's mixed, and you would expect that type of answer. I was a part of the conservative resurgence. To say I proudly claim that would mean I'm prideful, but I do proudly claim that I was in a seminary, Southern Seminary, during the 1980s that was extremely liberal. Some of the stories that I could tell would shock people, and I don't want to give the shock value, but I want grassroots Southern Baptists to know that the theological trajectory was so incredibly scary, so liberal, that the Southern Baptist Convention was headed toward not just a relevance, but even becoming a force that would concern me on how it would affect Christianity negatively. And so I am forever grateful for what the conservative resurgence did. And so I look at the state of the Southern Baptist Convention, I look at our 6 seminaries, I look at our state conventions and most of our churches, and I say, we are theologically sound. That's a lot to celebrate. It's really the first major Protestant denomination that has made a shift like that. So in the midst of the woes and the lamentations about what is happening in the SBC, we've got to remember that just back in the 1980s, as recent as that is in current history, this was a convention headed in a path that would have been nothing but tumultuous. So I celebrate that. Then there's the mixed review. In 1950, it took about 20 Southern Baptists a year to reach one person for Christ. That's a ratio. It's not precise, but members to baptisms. Today, it takes about 46 to 47 Southern Baptists a year to reach someone for Christ. We are reaching less with more. We have more resources than we ever have. We have more people than we ever had, albeit the growth has slowed down. We have more opportunities. This is a more unchurched America than it was in the 1950s. But there is a stark complacency that is evident in many of our churches and even throughout our denomination. there does not seem to be the urgency that understands that people without Christ are going to hell. Some of it, I think, is sociological. All of it's theological. Some of it's sociological. Throughout history, the more affluent a denomination has become, the less urgent it has become in its evangelistic task. We get comfortable in our material possessions. Therefore, that comfort precludes us from the urgency of the gospel. But I think another part of it is that we do a lot of majoring on minors. At times we can focus on those things that have secondary, tertiary, maybe even less importance. And in doing so, not only do we take our focus off the main thing, but the world looks at us and they say, are they for anything or are they just against things? So it's a mixed bag. I am a Southern Baptist by conviction. Most people don't realize I did not grow up Southern Baptist. When I married my wife, Nellie Jill, and we were looking for a church, she said, you are the leader of the house, choose the church. I came from a mainline church background, and I ended up finding a Southern Baptist church. I found out what Southern Baptists believed. I found out what their core convictions were. I found out about their polity. There's hardly anything about Southern Baptists from a polity, doctrinal point of view that I don't like. And so I'm a convictional Southern Baptist. But I would say, with taking the blinders off, we have got a long way to go, particularly in North American Christianity. I celebrate what's taking place in many places overseas.
So what advice would you give to the young pastor, the young minister, or even the seminary student? I know that you probably give a great bit of advice to your sons who are in ministry and others around you, the young people. So what advice would you have for that young pastor, that young minister, that seminary student that's training for future ministry?
I love talking to my sons. I talk to one of them, sometimes 2 and 3 of them every day. Sometimes they ask me for advice. Sometimes I ask them for advice because I don't let youthfulness be a reason not to listen to someone. And I found some very wise young people, and sometimes I turn to them. But to get back to your question, what type of advice? I'd really go back to mistakes I've made, rather than try to show the wisdom of this old man that would be a stretch. I would go back to 2 of the major mistakes I've made. As a matter of fact, I'm about to preach in New Orleans Chapel right after this interview is over, and I'm going to be talking about one of those. It's the 2 areas that I think are the greatest neglect of young pastors that end up becoming the pattern of middle age and older patterns. Neglect number 1 is the family. You say, oh, you hear everybody say that. No, I don't think people say that enough. And we think at every age point that our absence from our family, our busyness that takes us away from our family will change in just another month or another year, and the pattern continues. So one of the main things that I would say to a young minister as I will preach in chapel today is you neglect your family and your ministry will probably fail. The numbers are stark on that. The second thing that I would say is in the midst of all of your strategies and excitement and eagerness, and whether it's First Church, Second Church, or wherever you may be, don't forget that you are called to be personally evangelistic. We have done studies and we have found, unfortunately, that the fire of evangelism tends to wane as people go through ministry. It's kind of like, okay, here are the main things that God has called us to do: prayer, the ministry of the Word, and to do the work of the evangelist. And those are the 3 things that tend to wane more. So I could get into prayer, I could get into the ministry of the Word in Acts 6:4, and I could say a lot about that. But the 2 main areas that we see neglect that will continue through a lifetime is neglect of family and neglect of personally sharing your faith.
Well, Dr. Rainer, we thank you for your time. We appreciate your insights, your wisdom, and what you're doing there at LifeWay for the convention, and I pray that God would continue to bless you and that God would bless your sons in y'all's future ministry.
Thanks, Blake. Good to be here.